Keanu Reeves had always loved riding his bike alone at night, when the city was quiet, the roads empty, and the world too busy sleeping to notice him. He could slip away from the lights and the whispers. He had a simple garage near the edge of the city, nothing fancy, just a place where he kept his old black motorcycle, the one he called his escape. He had spent years riding that bike through long highways, past dark forests and open deserts. It was the only thing that made him feel truly free, like he could leave all his burdens behind him in the roar of the engine and the wind pressing against his face. That night, the sky was heavy with clouds, but he didn't care. He needed to feel the road under his wheels. He needed the hum of the motor to drown out the noise inside his head. Keanu parked his bike near a small diner just off the highway. He liked this diner because nobody bothered him there. The owner, an old woman named Gladys, knew him by name but never asked for selfies or autographs. She just brought him coffee and pie, and sometimes she'd sit with him if he looked too lonely. As he sat at his usual corner booth, staring out at the rain that had started to fall, he didn't notice the group of rough-looking bikers pull up. Outside, their engines were loud, their laughter even louder, and the clink of chains and boots echoed through the tiny parking lot. Gladys gave them a wary glance, but didn't say anything. She knew the type, tough on the outside, but trouble waiting to happen if you looked at them the wrong way. Keanu tried to ignore them. He pulled his jacket closer and sipped his coffee, but his bike was parked right where the gang now stood, smoking and laughing. He could see them through the rain-smeared window, circling his bike, pointing at it, one of them even knocking the mirror just for fun. "You might want to check on your ride," Gladys whispered, her voice soft but worried. Keanu sighed, set down his mug, and stood up. He did not want trouble. He never did. He just wanted peace. But sometimes the world did not care what you wanted. Outside, the rain fell harder, drops splashing against the cracked asphalt. The leader of the gang, a huge man with wild hair and a beard that looked like it could hide secrets, turned to face Keanu as he walked over. "Hey, old man," the leader sneered, flicking his cigarette onto the ground. "Nice bike. Looks a bit too pretty for you." Keanu forced a calm smile, though his jaw tensed. "Just leave it alone, okay? I don't want any trouble." The other bikers laughed. One of them stepped forward and spit on the ground near Keanu's boots. "What's it worth, huh? Think you can buy us off?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "It's not about money, it's just, it means something to me." That only made them laugh harder. The leader leaned in so close Keanu could smell the smoke on his breath. "This is our road. Old man, nobody rides here unless we say so." Before Keanu could answer, one of the gang members flicked open a lighter. He held the flame under the bike's leather seat. The smell of burning filled the cold air, mixing with the rain and oil. Keanu lunged forward, trying to push him away, but another biker grabbed his arm and shoved him to the ground. The flame caught, spreading faster than Keanu could put it out. He crawled toward his bike, rain soaking through his jeans, but it was too late. The fire danced in the puddles, smoke curling into the night sky as the gang backed away, laughing at the sight of the flames eating the thing that meant freedom to him. Gladys stood in the doorway of the diner, horror in her eyes but too scared to come out. Keanu felt the heat on his face, felt the sting of tears mixing with the rain. It wasn't just a bike. It was years of memories, of lonely roads that felt like home. It was every mile he rode to escape the sadness that always chased him. And now it was burning, turning to ash because a group of angry men wanted to remind him that kindness didn't mean safety. The bikers revved their engines, throwing mud and water behind them as they roared off into the night, leaving Keanu kneeling by the wreckage, his hands black with soot, his eyes staring at the twisted metal that once carried him away from his pain. As the fire died down, he sat there in the puddles, numb to the cold. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Gladys brought out a blanket and draped it over his shoulders. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Just when he thought he might break apart, he heard footsteps crunch through the gravel. He looked up through the rain and saw a tall figure walking toward him, calm, steady, like he belonged there even in the storm. The man wore a weathered denim jacket, cowboy boots splashed with mud, and a look in his eyes that said he had seen worse and come out stronger. "You look like you could use a hand," the man said, his voice low but kind. Keanu squinted through the rain. He knew that voice. Everyone did. Chuck Norris?" he asked, his own voice breaking on the edge of disbelief. Chuck nodded, kneeling down beside him, his hand firm on Keanu's shoulder. "I heard what happened. Let's fix this. Nobody does this to a good man," and walks away. Keanu stared at him, the rain washing the soot from his face, hope flickering inside him like a stubborn flame. Maybe the road wasn't over yet. Maybe there was a fight worth having, not with fists, but with the kind of strength that came from standing up for what mattered. And in that moment, Keanu realized that sometimes when the world tries to break you, an unexpected friend can remind you that you are never alone. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn, but the cold stuck to Keanu's bones like a bad memory. He and Chuck sat side by side on the curb near what was left of the bike. The metal frame was black and twisted, steam still rising from the parts that once carried Keanu away from the pain. He kept hidden from the world. Chuck didn't say much at first. He just sat there, his eyes steady on the wreckage, like he was planning something inside his head. Every few minutes, he would glance at Keanu, then back at the burned bike. When Gladys brought them hot coffee in chipped mugs, Chuck tipped his hat to her and thanked her softly. Keanu just wrapped his hands around the warm cup, but he could barely feel it. His hands were shaking too much. "It wasn't just a bike," Keanu said finally, his voice rough like gravel. "It was my space, my escape, my freedom. They took that from me for no reason." Chuck leaned back on his boots, his hands resting on his knees. "You know what I see when I look at this, Keanu? I see a chance to stand up. They wanted you to feel small. They thought they could take your freedom by burning this piece of metal. But they don't know you." Keanu let out a hollow laugh. "I'm not like you, Chuck. You're strong. People fear you. I ride my bike and mind my own business." Chuck's eyes locked onto his. "That's exactly why you're strong. You don't pick fights. You don't brag. You just live your life with respect. People like that, they can't stand a good man. It makes them feel weak." Keanu looked down at the ashes of his old ride. "What do we do now? The police won't care. They're just scared of the gang. I don't want revenge. I just want to ride again." Chuck smiled, a small smile that didn't reach his eyes yet. "You'll ride again. But first, we teach them a lesson they'll never forget. Not with violence, not with hate. We remind them what respect looks like when you stand together." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" Chuck stood up, stretching his back like an old warrior, getting ready for a new battle. "We pay someone a visit. There's a man I know, owns a custom bike shop. He owes me a favor or two. We're gonna rebuild your ride, better than before. But we're also gonna show that gang that burning someone's hope doesn't kill it. It only makes it stronger." Keanu felt something warm push through the numbness, not anger, but something better, courage. He stood to, the blanket still draped over his shoulders like a cape. Gladys, who had been watching through the diner window, stepped out again. She held out an old set of keys on a faded leather strap. "Take my truck," she said. "It's old and rusty, but it'll get you where you need to go. Just bring it back someday, you hear?" Keanu's eyes softened. "Thank you, Gladys." She reached up and patted his cheek like a mother comforting her child. "You're a good man, Keanu. Don't let them make you forget that." They loaded what was left of the burned bike into the back of Gladys' truck. The tires squeaked under the weight, but the engine rumbled to life with a cough and a puff of black smoke. Chuck climbed into the passenger seat, pointing the way with calm certainty. The drive took them out of the city, into the empty hills where dawn painted the sky in soft orange and pink. They talked along the way, not about revenge, but about life. Chuck shared stories of old battles, not the ones with fists and kicks that made him famous, but the quiet fights, standing up for neighbors, protecting strangers, helping people who could never repay him. Keanu listened, nodding as each mile rolled by under the worn tires. He realized he had spent so long being alone, thinking that carrying his pain by himself was strength, but now he saw that sometimes strength meant letting someone stand beside you. when your own legs shook by the time they reached the bike shop. An old warehouse painted with murals of desert highways and eagles soaring in blue skies. The sun was up. The owner, a tall man with tattoos running up both arms, came out to meet them. He didn't flinch when he saw the burned bike. Instead, he whistled low and looked at Chuck. "Is this the one?" the man asked. "Yeah," Chuck said, clapping Keanu on the shoulder. "This is the one." The man held out his hand to Keanu. His grip was strong, honest. "We're gonna rebuild it, brother. Better, faster, stronger. But you gotta promise me one thing when you ride this bike again. You ride it like they never burned it down. In the first place, you ride it like they can't touch your soul." Keanu felt the weight in his chest lift just a little. "Deal," he said quietly. As they wheeled the twisted frame into the shop, Chuck leaned in close. "This is just the beginning, Keanu. You'll ride again. But we've got more to do. Because you're not the only one they've hurt. We're gonna help this town remember what happens when good people stand together." Keanu looked around the shop, the sparks flying, the smell of oil and metal, the hum of men who believed in building things back stronger than before. For the first time since that night in the rain, he felt like maybe he wasn't alone anymore. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the spark of something bigger than himself. The promise that kindness, once lit, can never be burned out completely. The old bike shop smelled like oil, steel, and fresh hope. The owner, who everyone called Ranger, moved around the shop like an artist, checking every piece of the burned bike. Keanu stood back and watched as Ranger's team, a group of older bikers, veterans, and young mechanics, circled the twisted frame like surgeons about to bring it back to life. Chuck leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, his eyes calm but sharp. Every so often, he looked at Keanu and nodded, like he was saying, "Trust the process. I don't even know how to thank you," Keanu said quietly. Chuck gave a small shrug. "Don't thank me. Just ride when it's done. Ride like you mean it, and help someone else when it's their turn to fall." Keanu watched as Ranger pulled out a box, old chrome parts he'd collected for years, each one polished, wrapped in rags, waiting for the right bike to deserve it. "Some of these are older than you, kid," Ranger said with a grin, "but they still shine. Just like you." Keanu almost laughed at that. He didn't feel like he shined. He felt bruised. His trust in people dented like the bike frame they were hammering straight again. But when he looked around that shop, men covered in grease, sparks flying from the welding torch, Chuck standing solid as a rock, he felt something come back to him. They worked all day and into the night, while Ranger's crew replaced parts and welded metal. Chuck took Keanu aside and drove him to a small diner down the road. It looked like nothing special, chipped paint, neon sign half burned out, but inside it was warm and full of life. Old truckers sat at the counter, a family shared pie at a corner booth, and the smell of fresh coffee hugged everyone who walked in. Chuck ordered them 2 mugs and a stack of pancakes. "I want you to see something, Keanu," he said, nodding toward the window where an old bulletin board hung on the wall. Photos of people covered every inch of it. Smiling faces, some young, some old, some holding babies or dogs or trophies. Under each photo was a handwritten note. "Thanks for fixing my roof. You saved my mom's farm. You were there when I had no one." Keanu read the notes quietly. Each one told the same story. Chuck had been there when someone needed help, no matter how small the act. "This is what real strength is, Keanu," Chuck said, his voice gentle but strong. "It's not the punches or the kicks. It's showing up when the lights are off and no one's watching. You think riding that bike made you free? Maybe it did. But maybe helping someone else ride again makes you freer." Keanu looked at Chuck, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of his fame pressing him down. He felt like a man, just a man who wanted to do good. "What about the gang?" Keanu asked after a moment. "They're still out there, Chuck. They'll hurt someone else. I can't just stand by." Chuck smiled, but there was steel in his eyes. "We're not standing by, but we're not fighting with fists either. Tomorrow night, there's a gathering at the old train yard. It's where they hang out, drink, scare kids, act like they own the road. We're going to show up to, not to fight, to stand." Keanu frowned. Stand. What good will that do? It'll remind them this town's got a backbone, Chuck said. Good people forget how strong they are until someone stands up first. Tomorrow night, you and I, we're gonna stand, and you'll ride that bike right through their fear. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked back at the bulletin. Bored. All those strangers held together by a single thread. Kindness that showed up when they needed it. Most, he thought about Gladys giving him her truck keys without asking for anything. About Ranger offering his best parts to fix a burned bike. About Chuck Norris, a legend, sitting across from him eating pancakes like an old friend. He realized then that the only thing stronger than fear was the choice to stand beside someone, when it would be easier to walk away. The next morning, back at the shop, the sun rose slow and gold through the dusty windows. Ranger's crew wheeled out the bike, no longer burned and broken, but reborn. Chrome gleamed like liquid fire. The leather seat was stitched by hand. The engine purred like a sleeping wolf ready to run. Keanu reached out and touched the handlebars. His reflection looked back at him in the shiny gas tank. Tired eyes, scarred hands, but a hint of a smile that hadn't been there for months. Take it for a spin, Ranger said, grinning. See if she remembers how to fly. Keanu swung his leg over the bike, the weight of it familiar but new. He squeezed the throttle. The engine growled under him like it knew exactly where he needed to go. Chuck stood by the garage door, arms folded, his eyes bright with pride. Keanu looked at him, then at Ranger, then at all the men who had stayed up all night just to see this moment. He gave them a single nod, a promise. He revved the engine once, twice, and then rolled out into the morning light. The wind hit his face, cold and clean, but this time it didn't feel like he was running away. It felt like he was riding straight toward something that mattered. Tomorrow night, he would ride that same bike into the heart of the darkness that had tried to break him. Not alone, but with Chuck, with Ranger, with every good soul ready to remind the gang that respect is not given through fear. It is earned through kindness that refuses to burn. And as the city blurred past him in a rush of freedom, Keanu realized that some fires destroy, but some fires light the road ahead. Keanu could feel his heart beat through his jacket as he rode the rebuilt bike through empty streets. The night before the standoff at the train yard felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. But instead of fear pressing him down, he felt something new, purpose. When he pulled back into Ranger's shop, the old bikers were waiting. They had gathered from all over town. People who knew Chuck from back when he used to ride through these parts. People who remembered what respect looked like before fear took over. They were not young. Some had scars that spoke of bar fights and broken roads. Some walked with canes, but their eyes were clear. They had come because they knew one thing. If good men stayed quiet, bad men would keep winning. Inside the shop, Chuck stood by a wooden table with an old map of the train yard spread out. Keanu took off his helmet, sweat dripping from his hair. He walked over, nodding at Ranger, who had been tuning up the bike all evening, making sure it would not fail when it mattered most. Tomorrow night, Chuck began, pointing to the map. With his thick finger, they'll be here, drinking, making noise, acting like kings. We don't going to fight. We going to stand, side by side, quiet but strong. We show them they don't own this place. Keanu looked around the room. Faces stared back at him. Truckers, farmers, mechanics, a single mom who had once driven trucks cross-country, her hair pulled back and eyes sharp as any soldier's. They were not fighters in the way the gang was, but they were tired of fear. What if they come at us? Someone asked, voice rough with worry. Chuck nodded. Then we don't swing first. We don't swing wild. We stand firm. They'll see that we are not alone. We are not weak. Keanu's hands rested on the table edge. He could feel the weight of this moment pressing into him. Part of him wanted to get on his bike and ride far away from the trouble. But another part, the part the gang had tried to crush when they burned his bike, wanted to stay. And if they don't back down? Keanu asked, his voice quiet, but steady. Chuck looked at him, then at everyone else. Then we don't back down either. If they wanted to burn what we stand for, they'll have to burn every one of us. And they won't. That night, the plan was simple. They would ride in together, not as fighters but as a wall of calm. no chains, no bats, no angry shouts. They would hold their ground with nothing but the truth on their side. The truth. That kindness, once tested, is stronger than fear. When the meeting ended, Ranger pulled Keanu aside. They stood by the bike, the chrome gleaming under the single garage light. Ranger wiped his greasy hands on a rag and looked Keanu straight in the eye. "When you ride in tomorrow, don't look at them," Ranger said. "Look at us, feel us. Behind you. That's how you'll know you're not alone. Fear wants you to forget that." Keanu swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you for fixing the bike," he said, his voice low. "It means more than I can say." Ranger gave a rough chuckle. "It's not the bike that's fixed, kid, it's you." Keanu stood there a while, after everyone left, running his hand over the bike's leather seat. Memories of the fire flickered in his mind, but they felt distant now, like an old scar that didn't hurt anymore. He knew the gang would not back down easily. They fed on fear like wolves in the dark. But he also knew fear only grows when good people believe they're alone. Back at the diner, Chuck sat across from Keanu again, mugs of coffee steaming between them. Gladys, the old woman who had given Keanu her truck when his bike burned, poured their cups full without asking questions. She watched them with quiet eyes, her hands trembling only a little as she wiped down the counter. "Are you scared?" Keanu asked Chuck, his voice barely above a whisper. Chuck let out a slow breath. "Always. Courage isn't not being scared, it's standing anyway." Keanu thought about his whole life. The movies, the red carpets, the interviews where people praised him for being humble and kind. But none of that felt as real as this moment, sitting with a man who had spent his life standing up for others when no one was watching. "Thank you for showing up for me," Keanu said. Chuck looked at him, his eyes soft. "Thank you for letting me." The next day, as dusk settled like smoke over the town, Keanu stood in Ranger's shop pulling on his old leather jacket. The other riders, men and women, young and old, stood outside, warming up their engines, their breath mixing with the fog in the cold night air. Gladys arrived with a thermos of coffee and handed Keanu a small paper bag. Inside was a piece of pie, wrapped in foil, for after, she said. "So you remember there's sweetness in this world, even when it's bitter." Keanu smiled, the smallest smile, but real. He tucked the pie into his jacket pocket and climbed onto the bike. The engine rumbled under him, alive and strong. He looked to his right, Chuck on his old cruiser, Ranger on a battered chopper, a young girl with her dad's helmet too big for her head, riding beside them. Together, they pulled out of the lot and onto the highway, their headlights cutting through the darkness like a single line of hope. They didn't speak. They didn't roar or shout. They just rode, steady and sure, toward the place where fear waited for them. And as the train yard lights flickered in the distance, Keanu felt the old fear claw at his chest. The memory of flames, the laughter of the gang, the smell of burning leather. But then he looked to his left, saw Chuck's calm eyes, and to his right, saw Ranger's determined grin. And he remembered Ranger's words, "When you ride in, look at us. Feel us behind you. Fear wants you to forget that you are not alone." Keanu's hands tightened on the handlebars. He leaned forward, his heart steady, the bike humming beneath him like it knew this was not the end but the beginning. They were not riding to fight, they were riding to stand. And sometimes, standing was the bravest thing you could ever do. The old train yard sat on the edge of town like a forgotten scar. Rusted tracks cut through the dirt, weeds growing tall where locomotives once roared. Tonight, though, the yard was alive. Bonfires burned in oil drums, beer bottles clinked, and the biker gang lounged around their bikes like wolves guarding a kill. Their laughter echoed off the broken walls of an old warehouse, loud and sharp. In the cold night air, Keanu could feel his heart thumping under his leather jacket as he and the riders pulled up to the yard. Their bikes hummed together, a low growl that grew louder as they got closer. Chuck rode at the front, calm as ever, his eyes hidden under the brim of his old cowboy hat. Ranger and the others spread out behind them, engines purring like a promise that they would not back down. The gang noticed them before they even turned off the engines. The leader, the same bearded man who had flicked his cigarette onto Keanu's bike, stepped forward, his boots crunching over broken glass. He smirked, pointing at Keanu like he was pointing at prey. "Look who crawled back from the ashes," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the matter, old man? Come to cry about your toy again?" Keanu did not speak. He felt the fear claw at his chest, but he remembered Chuck's words, "When you stand, stand together." He kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the handlebars. Chuck cut his engine and stepped off his bike first. The gang shifted, some reaching for chains and bats hanging from their belts. But Chuck didn't flinch. He walked right up to the leader, stopping just inches from him. "You did a coward's thing," Chuck said quietly. His voice was so calm that it made some of the gang members fidget. "Burning a man's bike to make yourself feel bigger. Does that make you proud?" The leader sneered. "What's it to you, old man? This is our yard. Our rules." Chuck nodded, like he was agreeing. Then he turned slightly, so his voice carried to everyone, the gang, the riders, even the people peeking out from the shadows who had come to see what would happen tonight. "This was your yard. But fear only works when good people stand alone. Tonight, they don't." Keanu swung his leg off his bike, boots hitting the gravel. Ranger did the same. One by one, the others shut down their engines and stepped forward until they formed a rough circle behind Chuck. Their faces were quiet but fierce: farmers, truckers, waitresses, old men with shaky knees, young kids with borrowed helmets. None of them were fighters, but they were done being afraid. The gang leader laughed, but his eyes darted from face to face. He saw no bats, no chains, no fists ready to swing. Just people standing like a wall that refused to crack. "What? You think standing here looking pretty is gonna change anything?" the leader barked. "You think your shiny old men and kids scare me?" Keanu stepped up next to Chuck, his voice steady for the first time. "We're not here to scare you. We're here to remind you this place doesn't belong to fear anymore. You can drink your beer, make your jokes, but you don't own this road, you don't own this town, and you don't get to break people just because you're louder." The leader's face twisted with anger. He stepped close to Keanu, their noses almost touching. Big words for a man who cried when his bike burned. Keanu didn't flinch. "It wasn't just a bike. It was my freedom. You thought you could burn that, but you can't burn kindness. You can't burn people who show up for each other. All you did was prove you're smaller than the thing you tried to destroy." For a long moment, silence hung between them. The gang shifted uneasily, their bravado slipping when they saw the calm in the faces standing against them. No one shouted. No one moved to fight. They just stood, together. One of the younger gang members, barely out of his teens, looked down at the chain in his hand, then at the families behind Keanu and Chuck. The kid tossed the chain to the dirt, mumbling something under his breath. Before stepping away from the leader, another biker followed, then another, until the circle of darkness around the leader started to crack. Chuck leaned in, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "People like you only have power when they're alone. Look around. You're not alone anymore. But not in the way you want. You've lost." The leader snarled but didn't swing. Maybe he saw in Chuck's eyes that even if he did, he would stand alone. He spat to the side, backed away, and barked at the few who remained loyal. They climbed onto their bikes, engines roaring like wounded animals running from the truth. When the gang sped off into the night, the train yard felt different, not fixed, but freer. The fear that once poisoned its broken tracks seemed to lift, carried away by the sound of the bikes disappearing into the dark. Keanu let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He looked around at the people beside him, Chuck with his calm smile, Ranger wiping grease from his hands like it was just another day, the young girl holding her dad's hand, eyes wide with wonder at what she had just witnessed. Gladys stepped forward from the shadows, a thermos in one hand, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. She handed Keanu the piece of pie she'd given him before, now warm and soft in its foil wrap. "It's not much," she said, her voice trembling, "but it's something sweet to remind you what we stand for." Keanu hugged her gently, feeling the strength of every small kindness that had brought him here. The bike that burned, the hands that rebuilt it, the people who stood when it would have been easier to stay home. As the first stars broke through the clouds above the train yard, Keanu swung his leg back over the bike. He looked at Chuck, who just tipped his hat and smiled. "This ain't the end," Chuck said. "But it's a good start." Keanu started the engine. It purred like new life in his chest. The others did the same, their headlights glowing like fireflies in the dark. They didn't roar off to chase the gang. They didn't shout for victory. They just rode, side by side, out of the train yard and back into the night that belonged to them again. And as they rode, Keanu felt a simple truth, settled deep in his bones. Sometimes standing is stronger than fighting. And sometimes the softest acts of kindness survive the fiercest flames. Days turned into weeks after the night they stood together at the old train yard. The biker gang that once ruled the roads like shadows on the highway began to fade away. They moved on to places where people still hid behind locked doors, too afraid to speak up. But in this town, the fear they fed on was gone. Keanu spent his mornings at Ranger's shop, helping tune up old bikes for people who couldn't afford repairs. He sat on the concrete floor, grease on his hands, laughter in his throat, a sound he hadn't felt in years. When kids rode by on rusted bicycles, he showed them how to fix loose chains and patch up flat tires. No one cared that he was a movie star. They only saw the man who stayed when it mattered. Chuck stuck around too, dropping by every so often with coffee and his steady calm. He never spoke about himself much, but his eyes said it all. He was proud of what they'd done. Sometimes he and Keanu sat on the shop's old porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills, talking about nothing and everything. One afternoon, Gladys closed her diner early and brought a picnic to the garden behind Ranger's shop. Families gathered there now, not just bikers, but people who had once been strangers. The same bench where Keanu had first sat alone was now surrounded by voices, laughter, and warm pie that tasted like home. Keanu watched it all with a quiet smile. He felt the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in years. He knew darkness would come back, as it always did, in quiet moments, in long nights when memories pressed against his ribs. But now he had something the flames could never touch, a circle of people who would not let him burn alone. One evening, as the last light faded, Chuck leaned over and asked Keanu the question that had been sitting between them for weeks. "You ever gonna leave this place?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "For the first time, I don't want to. The road will always be there. But these people, this bench, this garage, they feel like something worth staying for." Chuck's eyes twinkled under the porch light. "That's the thing about standing up for what's right. You end up building something worth protecting." A few nights later, Keanu rode his rebuilt bike out past the edge of town, alone but not lonely. The road stretched out under the moon, smooth and familiar. He pulled off onto an old dirt path that led to the same diner where it all began. Gladys sat inside, wiping the counter, waiting for him. He ordered coffee and pie, the same slice she'd once wrapped in foil when he needed to remember that there was still sweetness in a bitter world. As he sat there, a boy walked in with wide eyes, staring at the man who everyone in town now knew not as a star, but as the man who stood. The boy held out an old photo, a picture of Keanu at the train yard, surrounded by the people who stood beside him. "Mama says you're the bravest man here." The boy whispered, "Is it true?" Keanu smiled, his eyes soft and honest. "No, kid. I'm just a man who got tired of being afraid alone." The boy tilted his head. "But you didn't fight them." Keanu leaned down, looking the boy in the eyes. "Sometimes fighting makes you like the people you stand against. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still and not break." The boy nodded slowly, like he didn't quite understand yet, but knew he would someday. After the boy left, Gladys poured Keanu another cup of coffee. She sat across from him, her hands folded around her own mug. "So what now?" she asked. Keanu looked out the window at his bike parked under the diner's flickering sign. It gleamed under the streetlight, not just metal and wheels anymore, but a piece of something bigger, proof that hope can rise from ashes. "Now I ride," he said simply, "and when someone else falls, I stand beside them. The road never ends, Gladys. It just keeps moving." As he finished his coffee and stepped outside, he could hear Chuck's words in his head. Help someone else when it's their turn to fall. He swung his leg over the bike, the engine growling awake under him. The wind caught his hair as he pulled onto the empty road. The stars overhead seemed brighter somehow, and every mile he rode reminded him that kindness, once sparked, burns brighter than any fire meant to destroy it. Keanu knew there would always be people who try to break what they do not understand, but he also knew that one act of standing up, one circle of good people, one rebuilt bike could remind the world that respect, humility, and kindness never truly die. They just wait for someone to protect them. And with Chuck Norris by his side, with a town that refused to be ruled by fear, Keanu Reeves rode on, free and unbroken, a quiet promise rumbling under his wheels. Sometimes, all it takes to beat the darkness is to stand your ground and never stand alone.